It is January 7th, 2022. Hey guys, welcome back to Vegged Out Gardening with me, Kate, where we talk about Zone B gardening week to week. Last week we talked about basic goals and limitation for your specific garden. Maybe you've been looking at some of those seed catalogs. You can start thinking about purchasing seeds. And even though it's January, this is a good time to start looking to that if you're going to be starting things from seed. The past few years, seed availability has been somewhat hard to come by as the demand is so high. This time of year you'll want to check in on the availability of these types of seeds that you want and potentially some sales. So there's a trade-off. You can either wait for sales and potentially lose the variety that you want to get, or you can pay more for all the seeds that you want right now. But if you do wait and you do want the sales, I've done that plenty of times before, if you don't get the specific variety that you're looking for, the chances that you'll still find something that will work for you are high because there are just so many varieties for every kind of vegetable and flower out there. Unless you're looking specifically for maybe a rare one or a true native plant. On the topic of purchasing, if you have any big plans for your garden, such as building a garden bed, or maybe you want lights if you're starting things from seed, I would also start looking for material for those. Especially with the pandemic, the supply chains really limited what you could find for anything affordable for building materials or lighting. And that might be settling down by now. But since they do tend to be a little pricier, you'll at least want to get a sense of how much things cost and give you a little extra time if you want to space out some of those purchases. And the last thing you want is to need a garden bed or lights or anything big like that, like a week before you actually need them and you don't have them and you don't want to spend that much money all at once. So just some things to keep in mind. For me, I am hopefully this weekend going to purchase material for creating garden bed tops. It'll be a type of plastic with a wooden frame that I can latch to the top of my garden bed. Similar to a row cover, same concept. I'm just trying to make a little greenhouse of a garden bed. And I'll show you how those turn out. I'm really excited. I've tried a few different things, and I think this idea will work out smoothly. Fingers crossed. So aside from purchasing stuff, which you can always do for a garden, you can always spend way too much money on a garden, so it's always good to kind of keep yourself in check. The other big concept that I want to talk about this week is spacing and placement. First off, where is your garden or garden expansion going to be located on your property or whatever space you're using? If it's a balcony or garden center or front yard, backyard, where is it going to be located? And is this spot accessible? Can you easily reach a hose to that spot? Do you have to walk all the way around the house just to get to it? I find that if it's easily accessible, then you're going to be more motivated, you're going to be reminded constantly. And I'm thinking if you have a garden plot at a community garden, are you going to be able to get your equipment out there easily? Like, are you going to have to wheelbarrow all of your tools out there? Are you able to do that? Some community gardens will have running water, but can the hose get to your plot? Or are you going to have to use a watering can? Also, what is the lighting for that spot? Is it really shady? Is it under a tree? Or is it full sun? And sometimes your most open spot is unfortunately going to be a shady spot. So you'll want to make sure that the plants that you want to grow will work with that lighting. Also, is it a super wet spot or is it pretty dry? So for example, my first garden was at a community garden, but it was arguably the worst spot. It was way far away from where all the tools were kept. It was shaded most of the day, and it collected all of the water. So I got really good at growing moss and onions, and that's about it. I love onions. They turned out great, but I just wanted to be able to grow more. And so this last year, I tried growing in a new spot on my property. It was in a taller spot. It had lots of sun, but since it was on a hill in full sun, it was really dry, and whenever I tried to water it, the water would just run right off of the garden bed. And it was in the exact opposite corner of the rest of my garden, so I had to haul my hose from one end of the property to the other, and I'm probably not going to do that this year. I'm just going to expand my garden close to my existing garden, and then just build from there, and hopefully I'll get my whole property as planted up as I want to in time. So, now that you have an idea of where your garden is going to be, you'll want to start thinking about how your plants are going to be placed within your garden. That includes placement and spacing. Spacing is a little easier. If you take a look at the seed packet or you read anything about the plant that you want to grow, generally the spacing is pretty generous from what they advise. So you can push them a little bit, but you don't want to go too far. Last year I pushed one crop of green beans way too far. I tried to just cram in like 30 green bean plants in this small area, and I did not get much of a harvest. Spacing is a learning experience, and depending on your garden, it all varies. But that's the good thing about gardening, you're always learning. Placement, on the other hand, is a little more complicated, but it's also really interesting. My garden focuses on interplanting or intercropping or companion planting. It's all basically the same thing, where you are planting a number of different plants all next to each other, all in a relatively small space. But it works because none of those plants are competing with each other for the same resources. This includes light and nutrients. Some examples of intercropping that I use pretty consistently are tomatoes and beans. You can either grow determinate tomatoes with pole beans or indeterminate tomatoes with bush beans. Neither one compete for height, and the beans will actually provide nutrients for the tomatoes. Beans create nitrogen that is in a form that is accessible for tomatoes. So the beans are actually fertilizing, in a way, the tomatoes. Another example would be beets and kale. Kale grows really tall, beets are pretty short, and they both use different nutrients. Same concept, you could do Brussels sprouts and greens. The Brussels sprouts grow really tall, they're pretty nutrient heavy. Greens are pretty short and they're not very nutrient heavy. One thing that I do love to do in my garden is plant alyssum, the small white flower, pretty much throughout my whole garden. It acts as a weed barrier, it's a ground cover, and it encourages a lot of pollinators to come in and take a look through the garden. So I would really encourage you to Google interplanting or intercropping. It's really fascinating and you can do a lot with it. But you get a lot more out of your space than just doing a monocrop, and it keeps your garden and the soil a lot healthier. So for this week, I would consider what do you need to purchase if you have any big plans for the gardens. Take a look at seed availabilities if you're growing from seed, and start to plan out the placement of your garden and where the plant's going to go within your garden. Let me know if you have any cool intercropping combinations or if you have any questions. But next week we will talk about growing for 3 seasons, not just the summer, but the spring, summer, and fall, and what's involved in planning for that. Thank you for tuning in to Vegged Out Gardening with me, Kate, and we will see you next week. Have a good week, everyone. Bye.